I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. On August 4th, Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes put former President Jair Bolsonaro under home arrest for violating restraining orders in a lawsuit related to a coup attempt in 2022. The ruling came after Bolsonaro participated remotely in demonstrations supporting him on August 3rd over the weekend. On July 30th, U.S. President Donald Trump enacted additional 40% tariffs on some Brazilian goods, taking the total to 50%, citing an alleged political persecution of Bolsonaro. On the same day, the U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned Justice Moraes under the Global Magnitsky Act, which usually targets individuals and entities involved in serious human rights violations. Brazil is now entangled in a situation that involves domestic politics, the independence of its judiciary, bilateral relations with the United States, and the economic impacts of Trump's tariffs on its trade and economy. RANE's Latin America analyst, Mario Braga, is here to lay out likely scenarios and discuss various implications of these developments. Hey Mario, how's it going?
Hi Emma, I'm fine, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Just so everyone is kind of on the same page, can you explain how Brazil got here and what we can expect for the coming weeks and months?
Sure. I think it's important to have in mind that this ongoing lawsuit against Bolsonaro, it dates back to 2022 in the presidential elections, which Bolsonaro lost. Back then, we had his supporters protesting the results. In January 2023, they stormed government buildings in Brasilia, especially like the headquarters of the Supreme Court, they stormed Congress and also the presidential palace. And investigations since then have indicated a coordinated effort that involved Bolsonaro and some of his close allies within his administration. So former ministers, high-ranking officials in the military, that they coordinated in an attempt to overturn the electoral results. And this is just one of many investigations that the former president is facing, but it's the one that he has already been indicted for, and that is awaiting trial. And the trial is likely to begin over the coming weeks, probably by September. And this whole situation comes amid like heightened both social and political polarization in Brazil that dates back many times before that, even around Bolsonaro's first election when he was elected president in 2018. But that has persisted over the past years and even to the president, and will also likely be present in the 2026 presidential dispute. So it's against this controversial case that the Supreme Court and many on the left in Brazil claim that these investigations and lawsuits, they are needed to preserve Brazil's democracy, Brazilian institutions and rule of law, while in turn you have Bolsonaro and his allies claiming that he's the victim of a political persecution, that they are just kind of, Brazil is under a judiciary dictatorship, and they are using their connections, not only with allies in Congress, but also with the Trump administration to get the US government to pressure both the Brazilian executive branch, but the judiciary branch, to drop the charges or to halt the lawsuit and the trial. And that's where we have like the tariffs and everything else involved in this, what was supposed to be a domestic political situation.
So Bolsonaro's term as president ended in December 2022. Why is he still so important, not only for Brazilian domestic politics, but for other aspects of the country as well?
Yeah, we need to have in mind that Bolsonaro, although he was controversial, divisive, he was a popular president, and he managed to secure a solid base of hardline supporters within Brazilian society that backed like his opposition to cultural issues, social minorities, the reduced presence of the state in the economy, his rhetorical fight against corruption, or the heavy-handed approach to crime. All these things secured him kind of a solid base of supporters in Brazil. And this was evident, especially the divide within Brazilian society when we had the 2022 election, when Bolsonaro lost, but he lost receiving 49.1% of the vote, while President da Silva, who got elected, he got like 50.9% of the vote. So that's how divided the country is and has been over the past years. And although Bolsonaro has been barred from running for office because of irregularities in his 2022 campaign, he's still influential, not only among the right-wing part of the Brazilian electorate, but among right-wing politicians, the more centrist and pro-business part of the Brazilian Congress. And any right-wing candidate should successfully challenge President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva next year will likely need to either be endorsed or at least not have the open opposition of Bolsonaro to successfully run. So he still has this influence over what are the current negotiations, who is likely to support, for example, an amnesty for his crimes if he's convicted, if this right-wing candidate gets elected. And then there is the opposition to that within the other parts of Brazilian voters, the more centrist or the leftist. And basically, on top of that, he has sought, as I said before, to use his connections within the Trump administration to get the US government to pressure Brazil, not only by imposing individual sanctions on Brazilian Supreme Court justices, as they had with the kind of the Magnitsky Act against Justice Moraes, but Trump, when he issued a letter for President da Silva on the 9th of July, saying that he would impose 50% tariffs on Brazil, he said that part of that was because of what he described as a witch hunt against Bolsonaro. So there is now this kind of trade/economic impact in Brazil that is also tied to the fate, the political fate, the trial results involving the former president as well.
Regarding the U.S. tariffs, how significant are they for the Brazilian economy, and what is the likelihood that the country secures a deal with Washington like other nations have done?
Well, Brazil is less exposed to trade with the U.S. than other countries that have rushed to secure trade deals with the White House. So when you think about, for example, Mexico and Canada that have supply chains much more integrated, or even other regions of the world like the EU that just got a deal, or even Japan, the portion of Brazil's total exports that go to the US is only 12%, and they represent just 2% of the country's GDP. So what many economists have estimated is that even if we had a 50% tariff on all Brazilian goods, that would lead to a reduction in the country's GDP by 0.3, 0.4 percentage points. So nothing that would translate into a significant crisis or a recession or anything like that. But then we need to break down and see the more granular impact on the economy, because you do have some sectors that rely a lot on exports to the US. And that's especially motors, aircraft, plastic, coal, chemicals. And the impact on these specific sectors then could be more significant. But what we had is that when the White House executive order came out on the 30th of July, there were nearly 700 exemptions to the additional 40% tariffs, because Brazil is facing the 10% baseline tariff since April, and there was a new executive order enacting an additional 40% tariff on Brazilian goods. But with the nearly 700 items that were exempted, a lot of important sectors that make the bulk of Brazil's exports, they are not exposed to these new tariffs, and that includes oil and gas. It includes aircraft, wood and pulp, and also orange juice, for instance. So when you look into more detail, around 36% of Brazilian exports will face these new tariffs, 36% of the exports to the United States. So the impact will be mostly limited, and that's a reflection and a result mostly of pressure from U.S. private sector on the Trump administration. Because if the Trump administration did an additional 40% tariff on all of these goods, there would likely be inflationary pressure in the United States. So when you think about, let's say, orange juice for end consumers, but also aircraft and how regional aviation industry in the U.S. relies on aircraft from Brazilian Embraer. So all these kinds of things were taken into consideration. And because of U.S. interests, these items were exempted. But that happened despite the two governments not engaging in any direct negotiations. And that's because there is a clear ideological divide between the Trump administration and that of Brazilian President Lula da Silva. And because of this political element that Trump has not resorted to when imposing the tariffs on other countries, the Brazilian government is in a position that it's not willing to negotiate tariffs if that means, for example, interfering with the independence of its judiciary, or if it means the country, as what has been framed domestically, like giving up on its sovereignty, right? And that makes a deal very, very unlikely. And over the past weeks, we had additional events that make a deal even harder. So just on the 4th of August, for instance, Justice de Moraes, the same Supreme Court justice, he ordered the home arrest of Bolsonaro because of his participation in the demonstrations. And that's something that the U.S. Department of State has already reacted to. They say that this is wrongful and that the White House is closely watching. So the mix between the political interests of the Trump administration in Brazil, the Brazilian government's reluctance to give in to this pressure will make the trade aspect of these negotiations to be very hard. So although there could be concessions when it comes to access to the ethanol market or cooperation on rare earths and critical minerals, or even Brazil adopting more streamlined patent procedures and things that are very much around trade and economics, these are unlikely to unfold because of the gridlock on the political dispute between the two countries.
Brazilian legal experts have considered Moraes' decisions controversial, and his rulings have also sparked outrage among right-wing supporters. What are the concrete concerns around the judiciary in Brazil?
Yeah, there has been a growing debate in Brazil, and this is not recent. This dates back, we can talk about like over the past decade, of an increased role of the judiciary in political affairs. That's in part because you have minority parties in Congress that they are unhappy with the results of votes, or that they want to challenge what has been approved, and then they resort to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in Brazil concentrates a lot of power. It's a constitutional court, but it also oversees cases that involves high-ranking, like federal level politicians. The single justices, they have the ability and the power to issue make their own decisions, like monocratic decisions. So this basing into a scenario in which when we get to the 2022 elections and the Supreme Court understands that Bolsonaro's efforts to challenge the legitimacy of the country's electoral system, that there is a risk that the president will use his power as head of state, as president, the economic power he has to overturn the results, to challenge the Brazilian institutions. The Supreme Court adopts a more confrontational style, so to speak, and they see their role as this role of defending the democratic institutions. There are some analogies there. Of course, they are imperfect, but it's to what we see in Germany, for instance, in which the democracy is seen as being able to defend itself from threats. And that's, for example, different from what we have in the First Amendment in the US, in the freedom of speech. And in Brazil, the Constitution has provisions that allow legislation and rules to curb, for example, hate speech or the spread of misinformation. And that has translated into rulings that amount to the suspension of some social media accounts of users that are deemed to be like having the intention to spread political misinformation or disinformation. And this whole scenario in which the court adopts a more ostensive approach has led to the pushback from US tech companies in Brazil. So they had, for example, to take down user profiles, when you had X being suspended for denying to comply with either rulings or legislation. And all these debate, it kind of evolved into a broader question that to which extent is the court really just defending the country's democracy and institutions, or to which extent it has overstepped its prerogatives and is just kind of imposing censorship or being politically biased in its rulings. And I think that's the crossroads where we find ourselves now, in which you have, for example, President Trump and the US administration accusing Moraes of violating human rights. That's the groundings for the Magnitsky Act against him. Or when you have, on the contrary, like civil society in Brazil, some leftist groups claiming that if it weren't for the Supreme Court acting this way, we may not have free and fair elections, or we would have the election results of 2022 overturned. So it's a delicate situation. So I think that you have arguments on both sides, and the challenge now is finding a solution or having a scenario in which all parties they abide by the court rulings, but that these rulings are within the realm of the Brazilian constitution.
Brazil will hold general elections in October 2026. How will all these events that we've been discussing influence the vote? I imagine there are pros and cons both for President da Silva from the left and for other right-wing contenders, right?
Yeah, this is something that will certainly have implications. What we have so far is, of course, when you have Donald Trump making very clear that the tariffs are tied to the lawsuits against Bolsonaro, this will further fuel polarization. As I said, like that's something that has already been present, but I think it will be exacerbated. And when we see already the polls in recent weeks, what they indicate is that these developments, they have helped President da Silva regain some of the popularity among his own base. For the past months, the government was struggling to find a narrative. His popularity was declining. It was starting to look like increasingly challenging for him how to get to 2026. And the fact that you now have a foreign government trying to interfere in domestic affairs, it gives the president a very clear narrative that he will defend Brazil's democracy, Brazil's institutions. You have the so-called like rally around the flag effect. So that has given Lula a boost, but it's not the same, and it's very far from what we saw, for example, in Canada, in which the impact on the election was very significant. And I think that part of that is because you still have among Bolsonaro supporters many that welcome this more interventionist approach from the US government, because they do believe that Brazil needs external help because the judiciary is ruling over the country. So when we had the demonstrations on the 3rd of August, in which Bolsonaro participated remotely, part of his supporters, they were thanking President Trump for the tariffs. They were thanking him for especially the sanctions against Justice Moraes. So although Lula will likely gain some popularity, it will not be like a landslide that will put him in a very comfortable position. It just puts him back in the game to have, for now at least, a competitive race next year. And of course, we are still far from the vote. We have like 14 months, and a lot can happen until then. And on the other side of the table, when you think about the right-wing contenders, that has become a challenge for them because many of Bolsonaro's supporters, they expressed support for President Trump in the U.S. 2024 elections, even wearing MAGA hats, for instance. And now they are put in a different position in which they have to reconcile supporting Trump and all the support they have expressed with the fact that Trump has imposed 50% tariffs on Brazil and that this will undermine parts of the Brazilian economy, for instance. And that is especially sensitive for São Paulo governor Tarcísio de Freitas, who is seen as the most likely heir to Bolsonaro. He was an infrastructure minister under Bolsonaro, and he is perceived as a technocrat, as someone who is more moderate, someone who would likely be a pro-business candidate and potentially president. So when you think about big businesses in Brazil, they are pretty much paying attention to his moves because if he were to win the 2026 elections in Brazil, there would likely be what business would consider like a positive improvement in the business environment, in pro-business regulation, less interference of the state in the economy, more fiscal prudence, so reduction of social spending. And because of that, and how Tarcísio will need to balance showing support for Bolsonaro, securing these more the hardliner supporters from the right wing, he cannot be much kind of a radical in that sense because he also needs to secure the votes from centrist voters who do not welcome very much this perceived foreign interference. So the way Trump has behaved and how he has framed the tariffs linked to Bolsonaro, they will also pose a challenge to the right-wing contenders in the elections next year.
Thanks so much, Mario. Really appreciate your insights on this.
Thank you. Pleasure.
You can find more of Mario's analyses on this topic and others on our Risk Intelligence platform. We are also excited to announce that RiskBook, our complimentary risk news and analysis digest, is now available. Simply register on our website, ranenetwork.com, to receive this intel directly to your inbox every weekday morning. We've also included a link to subscribe in the description of this episode. As always, thanks for joining us.